Welcome everyone who is already in the room. We're going to give it a couple of minutes for people to join, and we are going to get started right away. Just give us a few minutes to wait for people to join. All right, I'm going to get us started. Okay, welcome to our March event in the book launch series on the future of work. And today we are very excited to welcome John Boudreau to talk about his upcoming book. And I think it's going to be launched at the end of the month with a very provocative title, Work Without Jobs. I am very intrigued to hear about it. And just a couple of words about us. I am Anna Tavis. I am the department chair or academic director for human capital management programs at NYU School of Professional Studies. And we are hosting this series this year. And it's been a very prolific year for the books about work. So it's not surprising that, and we are very excited to have John join us. John is going to say a few words about his own credentials, a lot of very impressive publications, but I want to get started with just a little anecdote of how I first ran into John. We were actually, and John, I hope you remember, we were working on this book that was called Black Holes and White Spaces. And we had a community meet and the kind of design thinking brainstorming session at Twitter headquarters in San Francisco. That was the first time that we really collaborated. And I remember contributing to that book that is currently still available on Amazon. I was very impressed that it's still there. But I know that you are an extremely prolific thought leader, over 200 publications. You are sought after for podcasts in various conferences. So delighted to have you here. And I would like to hear more about Work Without Jobs. You've always been on the cutting edge of the future of work, but it sounds like this one is about the present of work, more or less. Is that correct?
Thank you, Anna. Well, it was about the future of work when we started it about 3 or 4 years ago. It takes a while to get a book published. I actually proposed this book to an editor back in what would it be now? I guess it's probably 5 or 7 years ago. And the editor said, and I said, this idea, I'll talk about it today, is pretty tectonic. And I'm finding that in all the books I've written, it's fundamental to understanding them. And whether it's about gig work or work, they kind of lead the work, which is engaging humans without employment, or automation. And at the time, this was the pre-automation book. The editor said, well, I don't know if that's interesting right now. But this guy, Robin J. Suzafin, who you've written with, is doing some interesting stuff on automation. So that was the Harvard book. Why don't you write of the automation book, which we did, and it was great. But this book about Work Without Jobs was kind of in my head even back then. And I was delighted when Robin, my good colleague and co-author, came forward shortly after my retirement as a professor at USC and said, why don't we see if we can do that book? And of course, MIT Press was kind enough to publish it. So yeah, here we are when the book itself comes out at the end of the month.
fantastic. We are all, I know that my students are already reading the articles that you published with MIT and HBR on the same topic. And as we know, as we both know, it's a very, very hot conversation that,
Yeah.
and the pandemic accelerated this process. So I can't wait to hear from you directly. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Great. Well, then I'll begin. I'm going to share my screen, and thanks to Ellen and Nicole for their terrific support. Any mistakes you see in getting this all going is me. But I'm going to say share, and that's to get us going. Am I right? Good.
Yep.
Okay, great. So let me just use this slide to say thank you to Anna. Thank you to everyone at School of Professional Studies at NYU for the opportunity. I'll look forward to the Q&A and also to any feedback that you want to offer. We'll give you some contact information in just a second, but of course, Anna knows how to reach me. This, as Anna said, is a little bit of background on me. I'm not going to read through it. You can read it for yourself quicker than I can talk about it. But this gives you a sense of the career. It's about 40 years now since I walked onto a classroom platform at Cornell University at the School of Industrial and Labor Relations. That was probably September of 1981. We're just past 40 years as a professor, first at Cornell University for 15 years or 22 years rather, and then in the early 2000s as a professor and a research scientist at USC. And now I continue to do the work on kind of a semi-retired basis. Oh, and let me go back one. There is a website called workwithoutjobs.com if some of you are interested in seeing excerpts from the book and other things about the book itself. So this slide is one of my favorite metaphors for work these days. I've been using it probably for several years, and COVID has just accelerated what is illustrated here. We can think of work as traditionally frozen into something like ice cubes, standard shapes that we all recognize, et cetera. And they're called things like jobs and job holders and degrees. And what's been happening really for quite a long time is that these entities, jobs, job holders, degrees, have been melting, becoming more fluid. That process was relatively slow and not that noticeable pre-COVID for sure. And then COVID has taken what I like to call a blowtorch to these ice cubes. So I'd like you to kind of envision the idea of work as saying, well, if we traditionally thought of it in these cube-like, ice cube-like things, and what if it's melting? And what if those fluid elements that are emerged when work is melted or job holders are melted, what if they could be recombined in new ways? Maybe ice cubes shaped in the form of a swan, or ice cubes shaped in the form of a round ball for a cocktail, something like that. So that's kind of the metaphor you can keep in mind. What if our systems, what if the HR discipline, what if the mindset of leaders who lead the work were informed enough and supported enough that we really could think of work as more fluid? And so that's the general idea for the title, Work Without Jobs. It doesn't mean that all work is going to stop being contained in jobs, but it does mean that there's a different way of thinking about work that doesn't start with the idea that it is necessarily contained in those ice cubes we're all familiar with. One of the concepts of this is something called functional fixedness, which means thinking of an object only in its traditional use, like let's say a credit card can be used for making purchases, and then if you're locked out of your home, you might realize that that credit card is also a slim piece of plastic that could be used if you're skillful enough, and I won't ask which of you are, to open a door, for example. So we can think of work as jobs and job holders and degrees, that's kind of functional fixedness, or we can think in a more functionally fluid way about other ways that work might be organized. As I alluded to in those last remarks, leaders have choices about this process. Leaders vary all over the map right now. Some of them are completely unaware and assume that everything will snap back to the way it was before. Some of them are embracing, I'll talk about some of those examples, really embracing this idea of work fluidity and using it to increase their agility, increase their organization's performance, increase things like equity and belonging and sense of purpose, et cetera. And then other leaders are aware of it and kind of resistant to it. Please let me keep my jobs. Please let me keep the old way. So the HR profession in particular has a big opportunity here, I think, to teach leaders and workers and others how to think differently about work. The HR discipline has a kind of obligation, I think, to begin to think about how its own systems, largely based on jobs, are going to need to change in a world where, at least for some kinds of work, it starts melting. And trying to encapsulate it into a job or a job holder just isn't effective. So this slide is one of the things that we talk about in the book. It's a lot of words, but basically I'm just going to go left to right. This is the question. We talk about this as a new operating system for work in the same way that the operating systems for computers today are very, very different from the operating systems for computers, say in the 1950s or even earlier, which is when this job-based system was invented. In the early days of computers, the operating system did one job at a time. You would do your word processing, and then you'd finish that, and you'd start up your spreadsheet, and you'd finish that, etc. Today, of course, it looks like computers do everything at once, and that's called preemptive multitasking. And what it means is that the computer preemptively allocates CPU time by deconstructing it into nanoseconds and then giving a little bit to each program you're running. So when you're pausing for a minute in the word processor, it's switched over and it's doing some of the calculations on the spreadsheet. When you're pausing there, it's switching over and it's doing some of the things on that video, probably the acrobatic cat video that you've got playing in the background, or the music, etc. So by deconstructing CPU time and applying it in little pieces across lots of tasks, the operating system appears to be doing everything at once. And this new operating system of thinking of work without jobs, we think is as tectonic, as fundamental to the way we do work and the way systems operate, as is the change in a computer operating system. Okay, so now to this slide. The issue now is that leaders, even most HR professionals, do not have a language for this new operating system. So the signals that you need or want to apply this new operating system do not come as somebody saying, oh, I would like you to please bring me that new work operating system of work without jobs. I'm hoping with the book, we'll begin to provide the language for that. But today, what you see is on the left. You see operating challenges, and what you hear is, we're trying to be agile, but things change too fast, and no one knows their assignment. Now, that's a signal that trying to keep work in jobs, trying to categorize workers as job holders may be getting in the way of agility. Constraints or bottlenecks. There's the second row. On the right, our job requisitions are open for months. We can't hire enough cybersecurity engineers in some units. Other units have too many. We cannot upskill cybersecurity engineers quick enough, et cetera. Those are signals of bottlenecks in the talent supply chain, but also perhaps bottlenecks elsewhere. And again, no one's going to come to you and say, I need to deconstruct these jobs. I need to deconstruct the people. But the signal is that you should be thinking this might be an opportunity to apply the new operating system. New technology, very typical issue here is the vendor sold us these robots or this AI, and they sold it based on the number of FTEs that we'd be able to redeploy, the number of job holders that we would redeploy to something else. But when I implement it as a manager, it isn't that simple. The AI doesn't just replace these people in jobs and they go away. It replaces part of their job, and I still need them. And what do I pay them if they're doing half the work, but they're 3 times as productive with AI? So again, that's a signal that the system you're trying to use, job-based system, it might be worth considering an alternative. And then shifting organizational priorities and stakeholders, something like diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're committed to that. But if we say it's everyone's job, then maybe it's no one's job. Now, perhaps you can create a job called DEI leader. However, very often what that is embedding DEI into the way we think about work, melting current work, and then reconstructing it to better support DEI. So you get the idea. These are 4 of the triggers that we talk about in the book as a way to think about where this new work operating system might be applicable today. For a while, much of the work is going to still be perfectly manageable in the old work operating system of jobs and job holders, et cetera. So this doesn't mean you have to change all the systems tomorrow. What it is a call to action, a call to awareness that these systems may need changing, and that certain kinds of work, certain areas of work are melting, and that the response to that melting is probably not optimal if you say, let's try and hold on to our traditional system. So several operating system principles here. One is start with the work. We'll talk about that. Combine humans and automation. I alluded to that in the slide before. Consider all the ways that you might engage humans, not just regular full-time employment. And then allow talent to flow to the work as priorities evolve, et cetera. And you're going to see examples of that as we go through the presentation here. All right, so very specifically then, what does this look like? So on the left is tradition, the operating system that we're suggesting needs rethinking. And on the right is the transition to the new operating system. So let's take the first row. Work contained in jobs. Virtually every HR system requires that you tell it what the job is in order to define what the work is. Filled with people who have employment contracts and exist inside this box we call the organization. What we're suggesting is that concept of work is contained in a job becomes melt the job, deconstruct the job, and see all the tasks and projects that were embedded in it as fluid and as potentially free-flowing, so that you could recombine them in many different ways, some of which might not be jobs. Second row, workers are job holders. They hold an employment contract, they exist inside this box, and when they move from job to job to job. When we look at their experience, we look at job to job to job. The transition on the right, think of workers in terms of what I like to call their capabilities. This full array of capabilities that they have that may or may not all be being used in the particular job that they hold. There might be lots of other things they could do if we were to allow those capabilities to be seen as a free-flowing set of elements that we could recombine. Many of you are probably vividly aware of the attention these days to skill-based, essentially skill-based everything. Skill-based HR, skill-based economy, skill-based careers, skill-based purpose, et cetera. All good. I consider skills to be one really good example of the deconstruction from job holder to capabilities. There would also be knowledge, abilities, motivations, et cetera, that would flow into that right-hand box. All deconstructed, all melted. And then finally, we might say college degrees at the bottom. Traditionally, you are qualified for this job when you have this degree. And we look for that degree, that 0-1. You're not qualified until you finish all 4 years. And what we're seeing increasingly across a large number of areas and in companies very much already is this deconstruction of the college degree. The idea that we will, and I like to use the word learning for that the degree will melt and that we will see the elements of the degree and experience as things that we can reconstruct. Maybe we hire someone after they've done 1 year of a 2-year degree, because after that 1 year, they're 80% ready for the job that we have, and we'll bring them up to speed. And then they go back after they've worked for a while and they add some credentials. And yes, it may eventually add up to a degree, but the operating model is to look at the components. So you can see the difference from left to right. Again, this is this is the outline that I'm going to use for the next part of the talk. So each of these rows is an element, it's really a chapter in the book that we talk about. And I'll just talk about each one of them in turn, give you a sense of how this new work operating system actually operates. So first one, the traditional work operating system says work is in mostly stable jobs. The work without jobs operating system says work is deconstructed. Let me give you an example in an organization called Providence Health. So if we think about the nurse job, all of you have heard, maybe some of you experienced the nursing shortage. And the way you calculate the nursing shortage, some people say it's millions and millions of nurses in the next 10 to 15 years, is you have to start with units of analysis. And so economists say, here's this thing called a job, and it's a thing nurses do. And I'm going to count how many of those I think are going to exist in the future. And then here's a thing called a nurse. And that's a person that is fully qualified to hold this job. And I'm going to count how many of those. And the way I know how many we'll have is I count how many of them are graduating from this impact thing that's called a nursing degree. And if I run all those things, I can get 1 million a million or more shortage of nurses. But notice the operating system, units of analysis, job called a nurse, person who's fully qualified to do that, who will take a job with an employment contract called a nurse, and their qualification is an intact degree. Providence Health, like so many healthcare organizations, faced a massive shortage of nurses when COVID hit. Even it was already there, and COVID just again put a blowtorch to it. This is the way that an example of several of the things that were inside a nursing job description. So what does this first principle mean about deconstructing the work? So, sorry, let me talk about the second one. The second thing is workers as job holders with the capability to fill job requirements. That's traditional. The alternative is people with capabilities that may or may not be being used on the job they're doing that might be available for other kinds of work. All right, so let's think about those two principles. Here's that nurse job description again, right? So you see the box, the gray box. This is what it takes to be a nurse. They do things like intubate patients, diagnose unresponsive patients, administer medications, but they also do a lot of time scheduling. And they're taking temperatures of relatively well patients or checking in on stable patients. How are you doing? The patient says, I'm doing fine. Hey, that's the job of nurses. There weren't enough nurses. So Providence melted that job. Now, where did the pieces go? Over on the left, you see where a lot of the pieces went, which is what they now call top of license nursing tasks. Yes, you need a nurse to intubate a patient, diagnose unresponsive patients, administer medication. You don't need a nurse to take temperatures of relatively well patients or check in on well patients. Providence actually melted the job of receptionists and allowed those receptionists to come in and take temperatures and check on well patients and even sit with patients. So, and then on the right, nurses were taking a lot of time scheduling shifts, et cetera. Well, turns out, not surprisingly, automation and AI can do that. So you've taken the nurse job, you've melted it, you've kept the things on the left, you've given some of them to human receptionists and some of them way over on the right to automation. You still don't have enough people to do the nurse work. Where could we find another resource? Well, hospital administrators, called the COO of the hospital, the CEO of the hospital, the chief financial officer of the hospital, often they're former physicians. So Providence went to them and said, let's melt your job. You have this set of capabilities that you're not really using in your administrator job called a physician. Let's get you relicensed, and the physicians spend a day a week on the floor of the hospital doing the work that was formerly in the nurse job. So you can see old work operating system at the top, new work operating system at the bottom. It kind of reframes the idea of what do we mean when we say there's a nursing shortage if we could include in that calculation this approach to melting and then reconstituting the work. Principle number 3, work as an employment contract, work as being done by people who exist inside the organization versus work that is perpetually reinvented. And also where we look beyond traditional employment to gig workers, contractors, et cetera. We have lots of examples of this in the book. The one that I'm showing you on the slide here, there was an insurance company that had cloud and digital engineers, and they were sort of assigned to units. Like your job was to be the cloud engineer for the customer interaction part of our process. Another one would be your job is to be the cloud or digital engineer for changing the way we do approvals, et cetera, et cetera. And what they found was that by fixing those people in jobs, they really had missed the chance to spread them out. The projects didn't occur unit by unit by unit. There was often a need for digital engineers, say, in the customer service part, and not so much of a need necessarily in the other units. But they couldn't move because they were restricted by these job descriptions. So fairly straightforward, they created a platform of these cloud engineers inside the organization, and that allowed them to flow like contract workers to where they were needed, no matter the unit, and no matter whether they had a job within that unit. And then what they did was they opened up that platform to external people who could also come in and do gigs or projects, et cetera, in the world of clouds, so that they didn't have to always have an employee do that. Same thing here. Another good example of this is as we look beyond the organization boundary, we can often find expertise that doesn't exist inside the organization. One of my favorite traditional examples of this, say 7 or 10 years ago, was that the pharmaceutical companies were trying to figure out a treatment for AIDS. Treatments for diseases often involve the way diseases are folded, the way the DNA of the disease folds. We're all pretty familiar with that now with mRNA vaccines and all that and how they plug in. 10 or 15 years ago, the interesting breakthrough was pharma companies, yes, they have these people called biotech engineers or biotech scientists, but this was a math problem. This was a problem about how the mathematical folding of the AIDS virus would fit with the mathematical folding of the drug to treat it. Now that sounds like a biotechnology issue, a biochemistry issue, but in fact, it's really a geometry issue, a mathematics issue. And it turned out there was a community of game players who on their own and voluntarily loved every evening to work on hard geometric folding problems. And the team, this platform was called Foldit. So the pharmaceutical companies placed this riddle on the platform, and sure enough, several human teams solved the folding problem, and they got listed on the article. So it's one of my favorite examples. I'll tell you now, that has been usurped now by DeepMind, which can do what those human team members did using AI. And I'll talk about that in a minute. A little closer to home, we talk in the book about a retail distribution organization, and as they automated their distribution center, the work began to really melt and recombine in ways that they couldn't anticipate. And sometimes they had really, especially with COVID, big surges in the need for workers there. So what they did was they created a gig platform. Retail employees in the stores, whom they needed less of, could come over and do a gig in the distribution center. Not a job there, but they had projects that they had set up, and those workers could come in and do those projects. In addition, they opened that up to outside gig workers. So now you have a combination of people inside the organization boundary, people outside the organization boundary. And in order to do it, it's not that the gig workers take on the whole job in the retail distribution center, it's that they take on part of the work. And only by melting that work and recombining it into a project can you make that happen. So looking beyond the organization boundary and even looking within it, we melt the work into things like projects and gigs, et cetera. Let's talk about work automation briefly. I think I mentioned that one of the dilemmas for leaders is that while work automation is often sold based on the idea that we're going to redeploy certain full-time equivalents, automation is going to, very typical, there's websites you can go to where you can type in a job description, it'll tell you how likely is your job to be replaced by automation. Now so workers are very concerned, automation will replace me in this job. In fact, when you look into it, which Robin and I did in Reinventing Jobs, all of the research on how automation affects work, all of the researchers realize you can't do it at the job level because it's almost never the case that automation seamlessly and easily fits into a job and the people go somewhere else. What you end up with is a combination of automation and people, like I talked about earlier. And so all of the research is done at the task level. What's really being examined is how automation affects the different tasks that people do. And then they come up honestly with some kind of arbitrary number like, well, if 50% of the tasks in your job are likely to be replaced, then we're going to say your job is 50% likely to be automated. But it's really not correct because what's really going to be there is 50% of the job is still human and 50% is still automation. So the only way you can really optimize automation, you can really see the pattern, you have to melt those jobs and you have to let automation take part of it and humans take part of it. One example we talked about in Reinventing Jobs and referred to in this book as well, deep sea or land-based oil drilling. Traditional system, the maintenance of those oil rigs was done by people who essentially were located at the oil rig. Very talented people who would sense and determine a problem, and then they would physically go maintain it. So people say those rigs are now automated. And what they often mean is that the operation and the maintenance of the rig is now done by automated technology. AI detects the flaws and robotic technology can fix them. But of course, The AI can't do all of that detection. And you still need a human mind that's creative and innovative about how to fix this stuff. But you don't need them on the rig anymore. So those people still exist. And if you look at a picture of what their job looks like today, they're in a safe, climate-controlled environment, and they work through an interface with the AI, and they help to direct and run the automation. So now, if you have a genius mechanic who's wonderful at fixing oil rigs, it used to be that mechanic was stuck on the oil rig. He or she could not move. And if another oil rig needed that kind of genius, too bad. That oil rig's got to rely on whoever happens to be assigned there. Now, virtually, the genius can move to where the genius is needed. And so it increases productivity all the way around. But again, yes, automation is doing part of the physical part, but other parts of the former job are now moved to that control center, and other things are added in that control center. So then we're getting to the end now. We talk at the end about the idea of managers coordinating work as collaborative hubs of teams and projects. So that the units of analysis that we envision now become more a set of free-flowing projects being staffed by a set of free-flowing humans based on their deconstructed capabilities being matched to deconstructed tasks, projects, et cetera. And the learning is much more at an atomized level of things like credentials, skills, experiences. How is that managed? One of the questions that came from a lot of our colleagues who read the book and read the draft of the book was, look, leaders are used to having people in boxes called jobs. I have 3 people and they report to me. And I know they report to me because this hierarchy shows a line from their box to me. And they're available when I need them. And they might be idle, but their job is to be available. And my job is to oversee the work they do in that box. Now you've melted it in this new work operating system. My workers might be doing 20% of their work for someone else. Someone from someone else might flow into my operation and do a project. So the new kind of unit of analysis for leadership becomes more like teams and constructed and reconstructed projects. People will flow through your supervision. They will flow through your project. And this is really where HR comes into play. How will we pay them? How will we evaluate them? Lots of creative solutions to that. And we can talk about it in the Q&A. But the fundamental idea is that leaders are going to be managing much more like project managers, rather than is, I think, essentially using kind of a crutch that says, well, I don't have to think much about the work and about how I lead, because we have these boxes, and those boxes tell everybody who works for who is their real supervisor, et cetera. Jonathan Donner and I wrote an article that you may have read suggesting that this is actually a much more human system, not a kind of robotic system, because the values, the ethics, all of those things that today leaders communicate through a few lines to a few boxes, leaders will now be demonstrating as people flow through very fast-moving projects. Essentially, you might have 20 times the opportunities to touch a worker, to oversee a worker in this new system than you do in the old one, where we might have a performance review every year and people might change jobs every few years. So that's 20 times the velocity. And if leaders are doing a great job of consistently across them communicating values, ethics, et cetera, 20 times the velocity of that great work. On the downside, 20 times the velocity of bad leadership to do harm. So this really begins to elevate the level of leadership in a very human system. A good example on the right, Unilever, and you can read about this everywhere. Unilever is kind of a poster child for this. They have something called Flex and something called UWork. The Flex system was essentially an internal platform where leaders were invited when they had work to be done. They changed the question from, can I get a job requisition, to tell me about the work. They would formulate a project to reflect the work that needed to be done, not a job. Leaders would post that project on an internal platform, kind of like a freelance platform, but only for Unilever employees. and Unilever employees can volunteer to take on a project in addition to their regular job. Unilever found, and this is pretty typical of companies, thousands and thousands of what they call hidden hours. When their CEO presented it to their investors, which he did, he presented it in terms of how many hidden hours did we find? How many people did we not have to hire because our workers found the extra time to do these projects? Now, today, most of those internal talent platforms, and it's a very big deal. It's a very bright, shiny object today for CEOs and CHROs and others. So many, many companies are putting these in. Most of them, as far as I know today, are voluntary. So they're not yet integrated with pay systems, career systems, and so because they're kind of informal, I think that's good, and they're very popular with both the workers and the leaders. However, I think we'll have a next stage when they integrate with HR, where we'll have harder questions and a need for more solutions coming from HR and other places about tough issues like pay, who reviews performance, how do we keep track of the development, all those sorts of things when we think about this platform integrating with HR. But today, if you want an example of leaders having to face into the reality that some people are working on projects, you can already see it happening in what are often called internal workplaces or internal talent marketplaces. And then finally, the final principle, we sort of moved out and thought about society. And obviously, if you start to think about work as being project-based, more and more workers working almost like platform workers, either inside or outside the organization, taking that to the extreme, the organization boundary begins to disappear for certain kinds of work, and workers might, and we've seen it with COVID, even regular full-time workers look more like contractors used to work. They're working from home, they're working remotely, et cetera. And contractors begin to look more similar to the kinds of work that our people are doing, just to give you one example. So the World Economic Forum has a really good word for this and lots of reports on this. They're talking about good platform work. And that might mean an internal platform if you're an employee, but it might also mean working as a freelancer, gig worker, contractor. So in essence, what they're calling for is an enhanced social safety net that spans work engagement, portable pensions, portable healthcare, portable retirement funding, portable information about the skills and capabilities that you have that isn't locked into one company's competency system, something like that. So eventually, what we suggest is that policy leaders and others will need to create a society that is better suited to supporting this kind of work. A good example that I'll put in your mind is whenever I hear very intelligent and well-meaning policymakers or politicians talk about good jobs, I wince, because they have immediately reduced the social options that we can consider if they assume that pensions, labor representation, healthcare, et cetera, are going to be contained in a job, and that the way you get them is to form an employment contract with an employer for a job that is relatively fixed. As you can see, we're seeing areas of work where that just melts. And so I would love to see those policymakers talk about good work rather than good jobs. And I'll just say, the next time you hear a discussion about the social issues around work, listen carefully and see if you don't agree that the word job may be restricting our thinking about the social options that are available. So now I'll just conclude and recap a little bit, and then we'll have a chat. Remember that this doesn't have to happen everywhere. One of the things we hear a lot when people hear the title of the book or begin to think about these things is, oh my goodness, this will be daunting in our organization. Our HR systems can't handle this new work operating system. We need jobs in order to run our systems. Our leaders are not ready to think of people as fluidly moving from project to project. Our workers are not prepared. They're going to wonder, what is my job? Where do I belong? All absolutely true. So you don't need to start everywhere. There are edges. There are places where you're already getting signals that something new is needed, where your leaders and workers already have energy to find something other than the existing system. And I'll take you back and ask you to recall the triggers on the left, the examples of what you hear on the right. And my recommendation is start in those places. Start to where work has already melted, where there's already energy, and those will become places you can practice and places where you can showcase the value of this. So again, I'll leave you with this concept of work held in traditional ice cubes, workers held in traditional ice cubes of a job, qualifications held in traditional ice cubes as a degree. What if we become more aware of how those things are melting? What if we creatively had systems that would encourage workers, HR leaders, leaders outside of HR, policymakers, to at least step back and say, wait a minute, what if we didn't assume this work has to be contained in this job, et cetera? And that brings me really to the big objective of this. I've long written that the ultimate accountability for making good talent decisions rests with the leaders who oversee that talent. Yes, HR as a discipline supports them. HR as a discipline can educate them, but ultimately leaders are making choices about this phenomenon. And I'm going to suggest that perhaps the ideas in a new work operating system might be just the thing leaders need to see their way through some of these dilemmas. So the question for HR leaders and others is, what are the values, principles, frameworks, and decision rules that are going to guide those leaders as we go forward? And so with that, again, here is some information about how you can contact me, LinkedIn, web, et cetera. I hope you will connect on LinkedIn, et cetera. And I'll look forward to the conversation now, Anna, with people who've shown up today. So I'll stop sharing my screen, and we'll have PDF of the slides if you're interested. And now we can move to my favorite part, which is questions and answers and discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, John. Just as a point of information for everyone, this has been recorded, and we are going to be following up with the slides as well as the recording. And obviously, John is a prolific writer, so a lot of the articles are available to you, but there's nothing like a live conversation. And I want to get started with the very first hand that went up, and it was with Michael Diamond, my colleague from marketing. Michael, do you want to speak up, or how are we going to do this?
Anna, I don't know if you can hear me. I'm actually in transit now. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I just first of all want to thank you, John, for an extraordinary, intellectual, but in a very practical and pragmatic fashion. So it's a lot of fun to welcome you and engage with you. And thank you, Anna, for bringing.
Thanks,
I think the question, I think you sort of alluded to it towards the end, which is almost like, how do you get started? And I'll be even more mundane. I'm a colleague of Anna's, faculty member in the school, and we work in a relatively traditional or somewhat bureaucratic environment. For good or ill, that's the nature of the establishment. But trying to redefine roles and get job descriptions rewritten, or even abandon job descriptions, seems like anathema or revolution. So how do you get started, perhaps in a place that has a different approach than, say, a Unilever might, a much more traditional, albeit very large, but much more traditional organization?
Well, that's a really good question, Michael. Thank you. And I must say my policy, having been a faculty member for 40 years, was that I didn't much get involved in consulting with the university that I was a part of. A little bit of conflict of interest, but also in part, not that the university I was a part of were not great universities, but I think higher education in general does tend to be more traditional and tend to lag a bit behind organizations like the Unilevers and others of the world. So I will agree with you that I think proposing something like like this is likely to be seen as maybe revolutionary or even more disruptive than that. Again, I think it's a neat question you raised about what would be my example in higher education. And I don't know that I have one immediately to hand or one that I can point to that we wrote about in the book. My thinking is that where you start to see this kind of thing happening is in the part of the university, perhaps Anna, your unit would be an example that has kind of moved toward maybe executive education or a stronger interface with companies. It might be a research organization. But maybe I do have an example. For example, at the Center for Effective Organizations, which is an internal research think tank at the university inside the business school. Ed Lawler started it about 40 years ago with folks like Sue and Monty Mormon and others. At the time he started it, you had faculty that were in regular tenure track faculty roles. And while this kind of a unit was going to be beneficial to them, the standard faculty job didn't really allow for movement to an external think tank doing action research with companies. You know, it was more of a kind of publish or perish sort of model. And so while faculty doing their job of teaching and research, et cetera, would love to have such a center available with access to companies, et cetera, data sets, their job didn't include building it, didn't include the relationships. And so what Ed did very creatively was to create, in this case, new jobs that were partly the job of tenure track faculty. So there was still rigorous research writing, but for the most part didn't include teaching in the academic classroom, but instead executive education. And a staff devoted to building relationships with companies, handling big databases, et cetera. So those became job descriptions. And what you have is a 40-year success story of this research center embedded in the business school, but operating rather independently of the tenure track job sets that you might find there. Now, more recently, the center has evolved even more under some of the work of Alex Levinson and others, and it's now built upon affiliate faculty that are not employed by the university, but that are leading faculty who find it valuable to connect with this institution within USC and provide great ideas, provide the capability to take on action research projects, et cetera. So I'm hoping that's helpful, Michael. I think it illustrates a lot of what I talked about. What Ed very astutely did was to pull this out of the regular set of job descriptions in the university. And again, I'd let Ed rebut this. Probably I may be getting it wrong. But what was always fascinating to me as a part of it was that it didn't exist in conflict with those other parts, but it existed to the side with its own mission, its own description of goals, et cetera, and was kind of not restricted by saying, yes, but how do we fit this into the tenure track part? I think units that do executive education, units that do a big research project with external companies, et cetera, they often reflect this kind of fluidity and this kind of permeable boundary.
Yeah, I think, John, our school is probably closer to that model, even though not all the way there, because we do not have tenure and a lot of our faculty are adjuncts, so we operate in this model, but we can certainly take it. I want to make sure we have 10 minutes left and we have some interesting questions here as well. I'm going to start with Reno's question about what do you think will change with the psychological contract between employee-employee in this type of operating model that you presented?
So that's a really interesting question. I'll be fairly brief. I know we have some other questions. I think my bottom line is, and I've actually written a scholarly paper in a book with Ben Schneider about work engagement on this. One of the things I think we're going to find is that it is possible for workers to engage at the task level. And that it's kind of fascinating to think about, even for someone with a job, what are the elements of the work that you're deeply engaged with and the elements of work that you're not? And so I think even engagement, when we say job engagement or job satisfaction, I think we may find even in the academic world that it might be task engagement, project engagement, et cetera. I also would go back to the role of leaders in the organization. When this thing is really going, you're going to have people flowing not only in projects crossing leaders, but in projects that cross the boundary. So I think we really do. There is a psychological contract there. The workers that cross those boundaries, the workers that work in teams, form a contract with their team members. That's the Hollywood model. No one works for a movie company except temporarily. But they all know each other. And when someone has a movie to direct, they reach out to that team that was on the movie before, even though that team may have worked on several movies for several studios before. So it's not unheard of. In fact, Wayne Casdale wrote an article many years ago about this. It's not unheard of that you can have engagement and a psychological contract, but the basis for it is different. It's not as, I wouldn't say it's, I'm going to say it's not quite as easy as saying, well, let's just call it job engagement, job satisfaction, and say where you belong is where you have your employment contract.
Okay, excellent. This Hollywood model is definitely something to look into. As you said, there are lots of precedents to what you're describing, but it's just has never been scaled to that level, and we didn't have the technology to support the scaling of this, right? The
Right.
platforms. You know, Stephen here is asking about if these types of ideas are being discussed at the level of the government. You kind of referenced that, but talking about the Department of Labor, and I know Sherm is familiar with your thinking, and Sherm is a big lobbyist in, you know, with the Department of Labor and in DC. So how are these ideas penetrating the decision makers at the government level?
You know, I have to say, I'm not personally involved in a lot of the good work that's going on at the government level to think about some of these leading ideas. I know that even in the previous administration and in this one as well, there was some effort to switch qualifications from degrees to something more atomized, something like experiences, et cetera. And I know that in some units of the government, they're certainly thinking about you know, some of the things that I talked about today. Task level, skills based is something that's really appearing there. The larger issue of could we move policymaking to think about good work versus good jobs, I don't see yet a lot of evidence of that in the US. It's much more prominent, what I find anyway, in Europe, for example. And that's partly because I think they're ahead of the game a bit on a portable safety net. You know, you already have sort of healthcare that's based on being a citizen rather than being based on an employee, for example. Even retirement and collective representation is something that sometimes spans organizations through guilds, et cetera, that way. So it's a really interesting. I will say, you mentioned the state workforce board level, Steve. One of the places that's fascinating on this is the pathways from education to employment. And I'm doing some work here, all due credit. There's a woman here in Santa Fe named Jamae Bliven who runs a conference. I think the next one's called Crossing the Cactus, but her company is Close It. And she's been working for decades here in New Mexico on better pathways from education for groups that are often overlooked into employment. And I think what you see across, what I've realized working with her, is that across so many counties and states, you have these really creative endeavors, often local, to take a degree and deconstruct it, and then take the work of a local employer and deconstruct it, and see if we can find pathways that are quicker and easier than waiting for the 2-year degree to be completed to hold a job at the employer. Really creative stuff there. And I would refer you to Jamae, J-A-M-A-I, Bliven, B-L-I-V-I-N, and Close It for some information about at least the work that she's doing. Thank you, Steve.
Excellent, excellent. We are actually beginning to do this work here at the city level. I know that our new mayor is very interested in being a lot more creative, especially with hidden workers and you know, braided careers, education aligned with on the job experience. A couple more questions if we can fit them in, John. Bram is asking here, where does the experience come in? Because there's, you know, if we kind of automize everything and break it down to skill, where is the proficiency? Where is the, you know, level of mastery comes in? Because you can say, you know, these people have these skills, but they're going to be performing at very different levels.
Mm-hmm. You know, and that's a good question that I don't know that we yet have an answer for. So at a technical level, what it goes to is how finely do you distinguish skills? You know, so how many levels does software capability have? You know, 0 and 1? Should it have 3? You know, something like early to moderate to mastery, should it have 10? I don't know that we've seen those questions really be addressed yet. So I think they will, and I think this evolution is going to drive greater attention to that. I think some of it will be AI driven. So AI will be able to tell when one more division of a skill would actually allow better optimization, the same way it can tell about features of products, et cetera, today. So it does, I think, change where the evaluation of mastery rests. So if we say, well, it can rest in a university or community college, okay, that's a vetted group of people designed to evaluate, who have a career evaluating capability and mastery. We might say it rests in a company and they have competency models, et cetera. Increasingly, though, companies are scraping LinkedIn to bring information into those platforms, to find assignments for people. So I think what we'll find is that some people are talking about a kind of blockchain where your mastery has been evaluated by people you've worked for, and that's all part of the system. Just like blockchain can evaluate and certify that certain transactions happen or that certain assets exist. So it's a really wide open. I think mastery will continue to exist, and one might imagine a future in which it's even more visible and more transparent. And that could be something that would be empowering for workers in a way that when mastery is held in companies today, that it can't be seen. On the other hand, lots of opportunities for misinterpretation, misuse, et cetera. And those are the challenges that I think we're going to face into.
If I could just squeeze in my own question, I know Sharada has a question here too, but just a quick question, John. It seems like this type of operating system applies to kind of the majority of jobs, but mostly entry level and kind of lower level. If you're thinking about jobs at the management level where there's so much uncertainty and oftentimes it's an on-the-job learning, like the pandemic hits, that other types of market forces, et cetera. Can you be a flowing CEO of the company and do it just part-time and then have a gig on the side being, doing pottery or something else?
Well, a couple of examples. I think so, Anna, and I agree that the management world probably hasn't been yet as affected. It hasn't yet felt the effect of this blowtorch. However, I'll go back to the Providence example. You're a hospital administrator, and we're going to melt that job and find valuable work for you as both the COO now and also someone who's on the floor of the hospital. There are many, many, many platforms that will offer a company a gig or contract working executive. So, we're a startup, whatever, we need a CFO, and we're going to go to this platform and they're going to come in and everybody understands it's short term, it's contract, and we need them for their expertise. Certainly things like legal advice, consulting advice, et cetera, which often looks like management in some cases, consulting on supply chain, et cetera, is often done through a contract, through a platform, et cetera. So I think that's where I'd see the beginning, Anna, would be that I think there will be a cadre of folks that exist in the organization and that provide largely the hub through which these teams flow. And those may very well have a job inside and be affiliated with the organization. As I say that, I'm not absolutely sure that's going to be true. So I think we have examples of even executive work being deconstructed and then reconstructed to fit some of these new models. And I haven't even talked about AI,
Yes.
which gets better every minute and which is likely to begin to optimize management decisions better every minute.
Exactly. All right. Okay. So to be continued in terms of thinking about how all of this is going to work out for us and we're all going to be flowing. Thank you so much, John. That has been tremendous, very thought-provoking. We can then continue to the discussion. As I said, we will follow up with a recording as well as John's slides and publications, et cetera. Thank you all very much. Ellen, can we see the last slides? Just a couple of upcoming books. This is where to find John. Go to his website. Everything is there, very well organized. and you can find information. And then we have a couple of upcoming spring events as well. In April, we're going to have the future of recruitment. And then on April 6th, and then April 20th, this is going to be my own book, Humans at Work. And I hope to see you all in April. Thank you. And again, have a good evening. And we are very grateful to John for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.